Today, I'm going to be having a look at some of Reform UK's fiscal policies in their manifesto. Reform were founded as part of the 2018 Brexit Party, rebranded in 2021. They are considered to be one of the UK's most right-wing mainstream political parties. Recently, in local council elections, they seem to have been getting quite a bit of traction, winning roughly 41% of local council election contested seats. But what do Reform actually look like when you put some of their fiscal policies under the microscope? Reform's manifesto kind of reads a little bit like a pissed pub rant scribbled on the back of a cigarette packet. Well, it's big on noise and short on sense. They're essentially hawking Brexit 2.0, promising to slash taxes, guts regulations, and take back control again. It's kind of a tired playlist of populist hits. It's anti-woke, anti-immigrant, and anti-everything that doesn't fit their nostalgic fever dream. I've had a look at some of the policies and, well, some of them don't really add up particularly well in terms of fiscal responsibility, and some of them can be quite potentially dangerous to the UK's economy. Reform claims that it'll generate £150 billion in annual savings, plus £10 billion extra tax revenue from economic growth to fund a £141 billion in pledges. That leaves £19 billion in a surplus, which sounds like a tidy sum to keep the Treasury happy. But there's a problem. The savings are speculative, the growth is, well, it's a fantasy, and the costs are wildly underestimated. It's kind of a gamble and not really a budget, and the stakes are Britain's economic stability. The manifesto's tone is all about common sense and taking back control, but the numbers don't really add up anything resembling fiscal responsibility. Instead, they rely on a mix of optimistic assumptions, untested policies, and a blatant disregard for the complexities of governing a G7 economy. Reform's £150 billion in annual savings is the cornerstone of their budget. They claim it'll come from policies like slashing government waste, scrapping net zero, and reforming the Bank of England's quantitative easing practices. One of the biggest pieces of savings is £35 billion a year, which comes from paying interest rates to commercial banks on quantitative easing reserves. Stopping the Bank of England from paying interest to commercial banks sounds like a clever way to free up some cash on the surface of things. And Reform name drops the Financial Times, the New Economics Foundation, and two former Bank of England deputy governors to give it some credibility. But this is where things kind of get a bit murky. Quantitative easing essentially is the Bank of England creating money to buy government bonds, injecting cash into the economy. Commercial banks hold these reserves at the bank, earning interest at the base rate of roughly around about 5%. Now, Reform argues that stopping these payments would save £35 billion annually based on the size of the quantitative easing reserves, which is around about £700 billion. However, there's a kind of a catch here. Messing with quantitative easing payments isn't like flicking off a switch. The bank uses these payments to manage monetary policy, ensuring that banks don't hoard cash or destabilise the financial system. Scrapping them could spook markets, and it could drive up borrowing costs and undermine confidence in the pound. The £35 billion estimate assumes that the base rate will stay high and that the entire quantitative easing pool will remain constant. But if the bank unwinds quantitative easing, as it's already started to do, selling bonds back to the market, the reserves could shrink, and so do the interest payments. In 2023, the bank estimated losses of quantitative easing could reach £100 billion over a decade, but that's spread out, and it's not a neat £35 billion like in the budget. Plus, if markets react badly to the policy, say by demanding higher yields on UK gilts, the government's borrowing costs could spike, and this would wipe out any of the savings. The 2022 Liz Truss mini-budget fiasco, which tanked the pound and sent mortgage rates soaring, is a stark reminder of what happens when you mess with market confidence. Reform's cavalier approach ignores these risks, presenting a complex monetary policy shift as a simple cash grab. Reform promises to save £50 billion by cutting £5 in every £100 of government spending. This sounds appealing, and who doesn't hate government waste? But It's a classic political sleight of hand. The manifesto claims that these cuts won't touch frontline services, but that's easier said than done. The UK's public sector budget is around £1 trillion annually, so a 5% cut equates to £50 billion across the board, and that is massive. Major departments like health spend £180 billion, education £80 billion, and defence £50 billion, and these account for nearly half of all public spending. So if reform protects these frontline areas, these cuts could fall disproportionately on smaller budgets like transport or justice or local government. But these sectors have already been squeezed harder than a lemon in a gin and tonic. Local councils, for example, have faced real term cuts of between 20 and 30% since 2010. This has led to problems like crumbling roads, closed libraries and stretched services, as well as potholes, and cutting another £50 billion without clear targets is like trying to trim fat from a skeleton. Reform points to bureaucracy and quangos as low-hanging fruit, but these numbers don't stack up. The cost of quangos, or non-departmental public bodies, is estimated at £200 billion over a decade, or £20 billion a year, and much of those funds are essential services like the Environment Agency or Ofcom. Even abolishing every quango, which would be chaos, wouldn't get close to £50 billion, and improving procurement, which is on the plan, is a tired trope. The NHS alone loses £7 billion annually to inefficiencies, but fixing that requires a long-term plan, not a 100-day quick fix like in the manifesto. This pledge is basically a soundbite and a feel-good policy, not a serious plan. Reform plans to save £30 billion by ditching net zero policies and renewable energy subsidies is another whopper. They argue that net zero is crippling the economy and that scrapping it will save households £500 a year. But this figure is a stretch, and the policy ignores long-term risks. These long-term risks include energy subsidies for renewables like wind and solar, which cost £10 billion annually through levies on energy bills. Scrapping them could reduce bills in the short term. Reform's £30 billion figure includes speculative savings from abandoning all net zero commitments, for example, carbon pricing and green infrastructure investments. This is problematic for a number of reasons. Firstly, renewables are now often cheaper than their fossil fuel counterparts. Offshore wind costs between £40 and £60 per megawatt hour, compared to £100 or more for gas in a volatile market. Ditching subsidies could stall investment in cheap domestic energy, leaving the UK reliant on imported gas, which spiked at £200 per megawatt hour in 2022 during the Ukraine crisis. Secondly, scrapping net zero risks trade penalties. The UK's carbon border adjustment mechanism is set to fully roll out by 2026. This will tax imports from countries with lax climate policies. So if the UK abandons net zero, British exporters, for example, companies like steel or chemicals, could face tariffs costing billions. The manifesto's claim is that households will save this £500, but it ignores the ripple effects and the fact that energy prices are driven by global markets and not just subsidies. Plus, reform also is pushing for North Sea oil and gas, but it's not a quick fix because new licenses take between 5 and 10 years to produce meaningful output, and shale gas or fracking also remains controversial and unproven in the UK. So this £30 billion saving is essentially a mirage. It's trading short-term gain for long-term pain. As part of its savings, Reform claims £15 billion in savings by getting 1 million people off benefits back to work through a two-strike job offer rule and face-to-face assessments. This sounds tough and practical, but it's wildly optimistic. The UK's benefits bill for working age people is around £70 billion annually, with personal independence payments and disability benefits making up a big chunk. Getting 1 million people back into work would require a seismic shift in employment patterns, and that especially goes for people long-term unemployed or for those with disabilities. The average cost of unemployment benefits, e.g. universal credit, is about £8,000 per claimant annually. So to save £15 billion, reform would need to cut benefits for nearly 2 million people, not 1 million. And that's assuming that no other costs like retraining or enforcement would be payable, which they obviously will. But unemployment is already near historic lows at 4% in 2024, and many on benefits face barriers like healthcare issues or childcare responsibilities. The two-strike rule, cutting benefits after rejecting 2 job offers, ignores these realities, and it risks pushing vulnerable people into poverty. Past welfare reforms, like the 2010 Work Capability Assessments Act, led to legal challenges and human rights concerns, costing millions for the government to fix. Reform's UK savings assume a frictionless process, which history shows is nearly impossible. Other savings include immigration, foreign aid and tax collection, the remaining 5 to 10 billion from immigration controls, 4 billion from employer immigration tax, 6 billion from cutting foreign aid by 50%, and unspecified billions from better tax collection. These are all equally shaky. The immigration savings assume reduced pressure on public services, but the UK's net migration is 300,000 annually. It includes essential workers who contribute more in taxes than they consume in services. The Resolution Foundation estimates that migrants add £1,000 per person to GDP on average, so a freeze could cost growth, not save money. The £4 billion employer immigration tax, or a 20% national insurance tax for foreign workers, might deter hiring from foreign workers, but it could also push businesses to relocate abroad, reducing tax revenue. Cutting foreign aid by £6 billion is feasible, but risks diplomatic fallout and secures trade deals and soft power, like the UK's influence in Africa, and the idea of collecting tens of billions in unpaid taxes is laughable. HMRC's tax gap is £36 billion annually, but much of that is from evasion or errors, and it's not easily recoverable through better management. So therefore, these savings are much more of a hope than a reality. If the savings are dodgy, the £141 billion in spending pledges are even more problematic. Reform wants to slash taxes, boost the NHS, beef up defence, and more, but their cost estimates are either underestimated or ignore implementation challenges. With the £70 billion to personal tax cuts, this is the biggest ticket on the item at £70 billion for personal tax reforms, primarily raising the income tax threshold to £20,000, which saves £7 million, or low earners £1,500 each. This is a blatant vote winner, which appeals to workers fed up with a high tax rate, but it's a fiscal black hole. The current personal tax allowance is £12,570, and raising it to £20,000 would cost close to £90 billion, according to the Institute for Fiscal Studies. Why? Well, because it reduces the tax base, which hits revenues from income tax, which raises £250 billion a year. Reform claims that this will make work pay. It assumes people on benefits will rush into jobs, but as we've seen, the benefits reform is unrealistic. Other tax cuts, like scrapping VAT on energy bills at £5 billion, cutting fuel duty by 20p, £10 billion, and abolishing inheritance tax for estates under £2 million would cost £7 billion, and this adds up fast. The IFS estimates that inheritance tax abolition alone could cost £10 billion by 2030, as wealthy estates find loopholes. These cuts might boost consumer spending short term, but without corresponding revenues, they risk deficits that could spook markets, as seen in the 2022 trust debacle. Reform pledges to eliminate NHS waiting lists with £70 billion. Now, this is a pure fantasy. The NHS backlog is over 7 million procedures alone, and the King's Fund estimate that clearing it would cost between £30 and £50 billion over a decade, as well as structural reforms. Tax breaks for doctors and nurses, which would cost £5 billion, might help retention, but the NHS needs 500,000 more staff to meet demand, and training takes between 3 and 7 years. Using private healthcare capacity in their plan sounds smart, but private providers are already stretched, handling only 10% of procedures. Scaling this up would require massive investments in facilities and staff, far beyond the £17 billion. The voucher scheme for private treatment, if NHS waits exceed 3 days or more for a GP or 9 weeks for surgery, is a logistical nightmare. In 2024, 40% of patients waited over a week for a GP appointment. Vouchering millions of patients would overwhelm private providers, driving up costs. The manifesto claims that this will relieve pressure on the NHS, but it ignores the fact that private hospitals rely on NHS-trained staff, creating a zero-sum game. This pledge is a populist crowd pleaser, and it's not a serious policy. The £14 billion defence pledge, £3 billion for policing, £2 billion for justice increasing defence spending to 2.5% of GDP is a worthy goal. But the manifesto's 100-day timeline is absurd. Expanding the armed forces and upgrading equipment takes years. Recruitment alone lags due to low pay and poor conditions. As the 2023 Army recruitment crisis showed, only 5,000 new soldiers were recruited against a target of 8,000. Hiring 40,000 police officers, or £3 billion over 5 years, ignores training bottlenecks. The Police Federation notes it takes 2 to 3 years to train a constable. The £2 billion for justice, including 100,000 new prison places, underestimates costs. New prisons cost £4 billion each for 10,000 places, and running costs add £500 million annually. These pledges sound tough, but the numbers don't really match reality. The remaining pledges, £5 billion for education, £8 billion for family policies, £2 billion for agriculture, and £2 billion for fishing, are smaller but no less flawed. For example, the education plan includes tax relief for private schools and scrapping student loan interest, but these benefit wealthier families whilst doing little for state schools, where 90% of kids study. The agriculture and fishing pledges rely on vague tax incentives without addressing global market pressures like EU tariffs or supermarket price wars. These costs are presented as tidy sums, but their impact is diluted by poor planning. These therefore are promises for votes, not results. Reform UK's manifesto is a masterclass in populist rhetoric. It taps into real frustrations, high taxes, NHS waits, immigration, and net zero costs, but it offers zero simplistic solutions that crumble under scrutiny. The immigration freeze plays to fears about small boats and multiculturalism, but it ignores the fact that UK's labour has shortages. In 2024, the NHS relied on 150,000 foreign workers, and social care faced 120,000 vacancies. Freezing immigration could cripple these sectors, driving up costs and undermining the £5 to £10 billion projected in savings. The net zero pledge is another populist gem. Scrapping it appeals to drivers and households struggling with energy bills, but it ignores the fact that renewables have stabilised energy prices compared to gas spikes in 2022. The promise to stop the boats by leaving the European Court of Human Rights and deporting migrants is a crowd pleaser, but it risks legal challenges and diplomatic fallouts with European countries, which could demand billions, for example, in France, to cooperate on channel crossings. These policies are designed to win votes and not to govern. The 100-day pledge in the manifesto timeline is a giveaway. Complex reforms like tax restructuring or NHS overhaul and reform take years, not months. Reform's rhetoric about the out-of-touch political class mirrors Farage's Brexit campaigns, which promised £350 million a week for the NHS, but delivered no such windfall. It's all about the optics and not the execution. If reform's savings don't materialise, and they likely won't, the £141 billion in spending could blow a hole in the budget. The IFS warns that unfunded tax cuts like those in the 2022 mini-budget can spike borrowing costs and crash markets. Reform's plan assumes no economic shocks, but global risks, energy crises, trade wars, or even pandemics, as we've seen, could derail these numbers. The manifesto's lack of transparency about its independent economists and costings further erodes trust, and without detailed methodologies, it's hard to take their £160 billion figure seriously. Compare this to Labour's 1997 manifesto, which promised fiscal prudence and stuck to Tory spending limits for 2 years to build credibility. Reform's approach in this is the opposite: big promises, big risks, but no safety net. If elected, they'd likely face a choice between backtracking on pledges or triggering a fiscal crisis. Either way, voters will lose. Reform's Our Contract with You is a populist manifesto dressed up as a serious plan. The £141 billion in pledges, from tax cuts to NHS fixes, are undercosted and oversimplified, ignoring the complexities of governing. The party's focus on hot-button issues like immigration and net zero is a clear play for voters. It's not a roadmap for sustainable change. Britain deserves better than this. Voters are right to be angry about NHS waits, high taxes and political incompetence, but Reform's UK budget is a fantasy that will crumble under the weight of reality. It's a classic populist move: promise the moon, dodge the details, and hope nobody notices when their numbers don't add up. If voters want real reform, then they have to look elsewhere, and this contract is more about winning elections than fixing Britain. Britain and its voters have to look at current parties and force them to protest to try and force reform, but not with Reform UK. If you've liked the video, please consider subscribing and leave any comments down in the comment section below. I'm sure that you'll all have comments, and thank you for watching.